Hello and welcome to the Right Around the Murray Festival 2021 program, Reshaped for Online Presentation. My name's Anne-Marie, WAM Festival Director, and I'm talking to you from the Albury Library Museum here on Wiradjuri country. And I would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the traditional custodians of this land and pay respect to elders past, present and future, for they hold the memories, culture, traditions and hopes of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people that contribute to our community. A big thank you to all of you who are tuned in locally and around the country, many of you in lockdown, many of us in lockdown, including those of you watching this as a replay later. We truly appreciate your support of the Right Around the Murray Festival and of literature and storytelling and the arts more broadly. We're thrilled to be able to present this afternoon's session, Historical Frictions, with Dorothy Simmons, Anita Heiss, Jock, Serong and Jason Steger. Thanks to all of them for transitioning to online format with us. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the session, Jason Steger. Jason is the literary editor for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, including the free digital newsletter, The Book List, through which he keeps readers in the loop with all sorts of book news and which you can all subscribe to. Great to have you with us again, Jason, for another year of WAM.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. It's great to be with you.
Yep, thank you. And it's a great session last night. Great to have you here for your second session in the program.
It's lovely to be here.
Before I hand over to Jason to introduce our panel, I'll remind listeners that you'll be able to type questions for the panel at any time using the chat bar on the right side of your screen, just as long as you're logged into Google. And Jason will come to your questions toward the end of the session. So enjoy this conversation, everyone. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Anne-Marie, and hello, everybody. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Yakulit Willem clan of the Boonwurrung people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Historical frictions. We're going to be discussing many issues this afternoon. And I mean, apart from anything else, it's tricky to decide what constitutes historical fiction. There's quite a generous historical fiction prize, actually, the ARA Historical Novel Prize, which gives $50,000 to the best novel. It was won last year in its first year by Miranda Riwo for her novel Stone, Sky, Gold Mountain, which was about two Chinese siblings on the North Queensland goldfields in 1877. But the interesting thing about the prize is that it defines a historical novel as, and I'm going to quote here, one in which the majority of the narrative, i.e. more than 50% of the events described, must have taken place at least 50 years before publication. So if you accept that, that means something. For example, Jonathan Franzen has a new novel called Crossroads, which is coming out in a couple of weeks, and that's set in 1970 in America. So Jonathan Franzen is now a historical novelist. There's another interesting comment that I read from Geraldine Brooks, the Australian author who has written several acclaimed historical novels. And she says, "The thing that attracts me to historical fiction is taking the factual record, as far as it is known, using that as scaffolding, and then letting the imagination build the structure that fills in those things we can never find out for sure." So today we have three fabulous guests to discuss historical fiction and historical frictions, authors of historical novels themselves. We have Dorothy Simmons, who is very well known to people in Albury and regular attendees at Right Around the Murray, because she's been on the committee for a long time. Dorothy is the author of Breath and Blood, which is set in the Parramatta female factory in the year of 1827. Jock Serong is the author of The Burning Island, which is a sequel to his novel Preservation, which is set around the same time, 1830. And Anita Heiss's novel in English is River of Dreams. In the Wiradjuri language, the title is Bila Yara Dungalong Dure. I got that wrong. Of course, I was always going to get it wrong, wasn't I? Bila Yara Dangalanga Dure. Anyway, look, Anita will correct me, I really hope. So please welcome Anita, Jock and Dotty. Okay, Anita, first thing, correct my pronunciation, which was embarrassingly awful.
Can I just say, anybody who tries gets a high distinction from me. Villa or river, Yaruldangalamdure. So Yarudang is dream, Galang is the plural, so many dreams, and Dure is the action of having the dream. So we have our own grammar system. So Bila Yaruddangalang Dure.
Okay, so it's River of Dreams, of course. Okay, now can I take you back to that comment by Geraldine Brooks? I'll read it again, shall I, just in case. The thing that attracts me to historical fiction is taking the factual record as far as it is known, using that as scaffolding, and then letting imagination build the structure that fills in those things we can never find out for sure. Is that the same? Are you attracted to it in the same way as her?
Who are you asking, Jason?
I'm asking all of you, so jump right in.
I thought that was for Anita.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm happy for Anita to go first. Is that?
Well, I would say yes. I think absolutely. I think we can only work with what we know in terms of documentation, recorded material, what we have in terms of oral history, which of course, increasingly has more value in Western society. And then I think the joy for the writer is being able to imagine the opinions and the values and the landscape and so forth outside of what we've got that's concrete knowledge. So I do subscribe to that way of thinking that Geraldine said.
Yeah.
Yes.
You go, Dottie.
I was just going to say, yes, I go along with that too, but you can extend that because you can think of, a stave and a bar of music. So you've got the factual lines going across, which indicate the framework in which you're working, but you can make up the tunes in between.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember thinking when I started writing Preservation, I'd never written historical fiction before, and I had no idea how to approach it. And the mental image that I had was this idea of pillars, and that I was stringing coloured lights between them. So it's very much like the scaffold idea, I suppose, that as far as I was concerned, the things that could be reasonably ascertained had to remain in place and not be tampered with, and that in the in-between, in the gaps, there was the job for imagination. But the great danger, I think, is that when you do that, anything that's written on a given subject in history adds to the great mound of stuff that's known about the subject. And the further back that recedes into the past, the less people are able to distinguish what is researched and tested and known and what's been made up. Mm-hmm. So you have an enormous responsibility not to mess with the foundational parts of the story.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a free-for-all then?
No, I don't think it is at all.
No.
I think there's an expectation. For me, there's an expectation from readers, or as a reader, that if I'm buying a historical novel, that the facts, the reality around that moment in time are as authentic as humanly possible, and understanding for me that as a reader and a writer, that the fictional side is the mechanism for telling the story, but the actual event is the purpose for writing the story, if that makes sense. And the structure can be, for me, I think, a mix of both fiction and faction, as it were.
Yeah.
Dottie, were you about to chip
I
in
was
then?
just going to refer to there's this sort of mythical anecdote where a man goes into a shop looking for the true history of the Kelly gang, And he doesn't find it because he doesn't think to look in the fiction section. He goes looking in.
Yes, yeah, that's very true, isn't it? That's very interesting.
Very telling, because I think as a writer of historical fiction, you do, like Anita said, have a responsibility to be true to the facts as far as the facts go. Fortunately for us fiction writers, the facts never go far enough, so you can go beyond that.
But do you tinker with the facts though?
No, I don't. As far as possible, I generally don't. No.
Right.
Sorry. I was just saying, I think on top of that, I think many people choose historical fiction as a way of learning about history and engaging with history, as opposed to, a textbook or, any other non-fiction work. So my feeling and my thoughts is, if this is the only time that they're going to read about, for example, the Great Flood of Gundagai, then I want to make sure they get as much of the story as possible in the format that they want to learn in or they want to engage with. So I think for authors, we have that level of responsibility and accountability, because this may be the only time that many readers engage with the kind of story that we're writing.
The thing I would also add to this is that even when you stick to the facts have often been messed with anyway. And when I wrote Preservation, I was working off a diary, and for the third book I'm working off a diary again. And the diaries are full of self-serving stuff and outright propaganda. Yeah. And when I did Preservation, I spoke to Yuin people about their version of the story, which had been handed down really accurately over whatever that is, 220 years. And they said, look, it's completely different. It's none of your business, A, but B, it's completely different. So you have to be very careful not to assume that you're starting from a reliable base, because you might not be anyway.
Well, the recording of history, as we know, is completely subjective, because the way in which the colonisers remember and record history is significantly different to the way in which colonised peoples remember and record history. So it's also, it's a great point you've made, Jock. I mean, we read through a lens and we write through a lens, and I guess we just need to be conscious of, as you say, the documents that we're reading and how we use those and how we interpret those, because they've already been interpreted through somebody else's lens.
Yes,
because that's the important thing, that it's not just the fact, it's our attitudes towards the facts, how we interpret those facts that change, and that's where you get the notion of rewriting history and so on. And that's where, I think you do have that responsibility to be essentially authentic, I think. And if you're not going to be, then you make it clear that you're not going to be.
Yeah, and presumably, I mean, Anita, if somebody was writing a novel around the flood in Gundagai of the Murrumbidgee, say 50 years ago, it would have been a very different sort of novel.
It would have been a different novel. And, I don't claim to, with Billy Adadungalang to have written the ultimate novel. I've written something that can sit alongside, whatever is already existing. I think, the publishing industry is very different. It's the first time we've ever had an Australian commercial novel with no English on the cover, for a start. And we've seen now an explosion of language appearing in many Australian novels, obviously Tarrajin Winch's The Yield, Nadia Simpson's Song of the Crocodile, and so forth. And also this recognition, as slow as it's been, that you cannot write an Australian novel in any moment in Australian time or history, and history is right up to 5 minutes ago, in my view. I know there's that 50-year, we can chat about that too, but you cannot write an Australian novel that does not acknowledge in some way, shape or form Aboriginal people, because wherever your novel is set, it's set on the traditional lands of an Aboriginal nation, and that nation has its own language, and the first language of this country is not English. And I think 50 years ago, that wasn't even on the radar. 10 years ago, not even on the radar.
But so when you were writing your novel, that was one of your motivations, wasn't it? To write with language and in language.
Jason, thank you for that question. When I had the idea to write the novel about the Great Flood of Gundagai, it was because I I wanted all Australians to know about that was Australia's greatest natural disaster and the loss of life there. I wanted to know about these two, Wiradjuri Minyarni and Jackie, and their extraordinary heroism in that period of time. But I didn't know when I started that novel that I would then that it would have language in it, because I didn't start learning my language till 6 months later, the age of 50. And when I was in the classroom in Wagga on Wiradjuri country also, and by the classroom I mean the lecture theatre, but I also mean the floodplains of Wagga and the Murrumbidgee and standing in the river and learning language, that I realised here's my opportunity to make a small contribution to the reclamation and maintenance of Wiradjuri language, and acknowledge that the work of Uncle Stan Grant, Dr. Uncle Stan Grant and Dr. John Rudder, and what they've done, bringing together, possibly we've got the most resources of any language group in the nation. And for me, even the authenticity of the story, even though it has language, the reality is those Wiradjuri characters would have only been speaking Wiradjuri to each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm not even fluent enough to do that. So in many ways, it was as authentic as I could make it. But we exist in a publishing scene here in Australia where the dominant language is English, and we write, I want people to read my book. And so, I wanted people to understand the complexity of our language. I wanted people to understand the beauty of our language. And I wanted people to recognise, or, come to some understanding is, oh my God, there were languages. There are still living languages as well.
Would you ever envisage writing an entire novel in Wiradjuri?
Oh, I can tell you, Jason, I wouldn't have the skills to do that.
Yet. I mean, you've only been learning 2.5 years.
I know, but I would like to. I could write a novel and I could pay someone to translate it for me. But I'm going to do a kids' picture book, and a lot of that will be on the Great Flood, and a lot of that will be in Wiradjuri. And my next novel, Didaya Wada, which means to rise up, will have more language in there, because I think what we're finding, as all of us as authors, no doubt, are finding that readers are becoming more, I don't think we've had enough faith in our readers to understand and believe and trust that they can be challenged and they want to be challenged. And so I can't imagine writing 130,000 words in Wiradjuri. My English vocab's not that big.
But it is the portrayal of Indigenous characters in historical fiction in any fiction is a sensitive subject, isn't it? I don't know, Jock, have you written Indigenous characters?
Yeah, I did in Preservation, and I did in Burning Island.
Oh, of course you did in Preservation. Yeah. Yeah,
and I have in the third book, and it's definitely difficult territory for a white writer, and I try to be really conscious of what I'm doing. I know, Anita, you wrote a little while ago about the topic of you can't have an Australian novel without coming to grips with the Indigenous aspects of the story you're telling, and I think that's entirely fair. And so, A, you can't shirk it, but B, when you grapple with it, you've got to do it, I think, with a lot of diligence and a lot of humility. In other words, making sure that you've done your homework about what you're talking about, and consulting with somebody whose story it is, or whose authority it is to speak about it. And then once you've done those things, try as much as you can to get yourself out of the road, and let the story do its own talking. The minute you're sort of trampling all over it as an author, you're starting to undo your own work. So it's been a real learning curve for me, and I'm still on it. I'm by no means there, but it takes you back to craft and the difficulty of constructing something that's actually authentic, because there's a million pitfalls you can stagger into doing that.
And I think
sorry, go on, Dottie.
I was going to say, I think there's a real parallel there between writing from that point of view and writing historical fiction as well, because in each case you're making a sort of empathetic leap into another consciousness, maybe of another time, of another skin. Because there's another brand. There's hysterical fiction where you've got low bosoms and people with rapiers and things, it is quite different. That's just imposing our consciousness on the past, or imposing our consciousness on Indigenous people. And what you've got to do is acknowledge it, and however you do it as honestly as you can, and make that leap and get your audience to jump with you.
Yeah.
And I mean, in the piece that you wrote, Anita, you talked about non-Indigenous people writing appropriately. And so how would you define appropriately when a non-Indigenous person comes to write about First Nations people?
Well, I did want to mention Terry Janke's True Tracks, which has come out recently. And of course, she's done a whole range of protocol guides for writers, for the Australian Society of Authors, for the Australia Council. And I did a code of ethics checklist for the ASA many, many years ago. And I think, I would just ask for people to consider the representation of the characters they're writing about. Is the work that they're writing empowering to Indigenous people? And what has influenced their concept of what their character looks like? I had somebody email me recently about something, an idea for a story they were writing, and the Indigenous character came from a broken home, all these stereotypes. And I said, why does that character have to be there? Why can't the character be coming from a home like I did, which was full of love and a completely different space? And when I've run workshops down in Melbourne, I've got on one side of the whiteboard, and it was for people wanting to write characters, Indigenous characters. And I said, I want you to write all the negative stereotypes you've ever heard about Indigenous people. And I read things that I didn't even know about myself. And then on the other side, I want you to write all the positive stereotypes you know about. And then I said to them, we looked at both sides, and I said, this is the side you need to focus on. Why can't we create a whole wealth of information, a whole wealth of literature that focuses on the beauty of First Nations peoples, rather than perpetuating through our own literature negative stereotypes and so forth. So I would recommend people who wanted to write to check out the Australia Council writing protocols, pull them down off the website. And I say to authors who come to me at the 11th hour when they want to slot in a character somewhere, that needs to be in the planning of your novel. Whether you're a pantser or a plotter, that needs to be on your planning. You don't just at the 11th hour go, I forgot to put in, an Aboriginal character. And the other thing I'd say is, if people are nervous about how to approach writing about Aboriginal community, whatever, play that ignorance out in your character. Right, as character. So I've read novels, historical novels, where there'll be a very brief mention, or even contemporary novels, a brief mention of some very generic mention, but at least it's there. And that tells me that the author wasn't confident enough to delve any deeper, but at least there's acknowledgement through their characters that, oh yes, this business is here now, but there used to be these people here then. So that there is some recognition.
Right, yeah, and certainly there's a very good scene in your novel when the character Yinda Yamara is out, and he's sitting around with some English guys and an Irish guy, and the Irish guy knows exactly the experience of dealing with the English, as colonizers and exploiters and everything, and so that's a very good scene in which you indicate how sort of ignorant the colonizers are, I think, through that dialogue between that very brief scene.
Yeah, there are many ways to do it, and we could do a whole conversation on that. And I just think I'm not saying that people should give up trying, and Jock alluded to this. I think my personal view is, if you have no personal experience with Aboriginal people on a day-to-day basis, or it's going to be very hard for you to write authentically. But like anything, if I wanted to write a novel, I did, including a stockbroker. I interviewed some stockbrokers. I go and spend time. I learn. There's so many ways to learn now. There's over 7,000 published Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander authors. You can go to the theatre. You can watch a movie. There's really no excuse in 2021 for any Australian author to make excuses, particularly in historical fiction, to say that they can't be part of a process of truth telling through their own writing because they're nervous about writing about First Nations peoples. My personal view.
Yeah. Dottie, I'd like to ask you about the Parramatta Female Factory and your protagonist, Anne Gordon. So you chose a very real person from history. And the way you've written the novel, you're in her head a lot of the time, and then you're using a lot of dialogue, particularly with the inmates of the factory. What was it that appealed to you about Anne Gordon?
I guess what it was that appealed to, it was a number of things. First of all, was being put in that situation. You know, it's your first day in a new job, and you've got a lot in your hands. How do you deal with that? And the other thing was reading such facts as I could about her life. The parallel with so many of these women in the factories' lives really struck me, and that comes out particularly in the central conversation between her and the fictional protagonist, who's called Molly Malone. Yep. And she and Molly probably find they have much more to unite them than divides them, and that the division is very much a social construct rather than an instinctive thing or intuitive thing. So so Anne Gordon appealed to me from that point of view because she was faced with this tremendous task, and I think she herself, she was in that job for 9 years, and at the end of it, they fired her because the governor and so on basically got rid of her because of a scandal involving her husband, rather than her. You know, so again, it was unfair dismissal, if you like, and it just struck me that she represented so much of I suppose the feminist thing.
Well, and the characters in your books, Anita and Jock, Eliza Grayling is a very strong female character, and Wagadine in yours, Anita, very, very strong, determined, young girl at the start. That was obviously, you chose those characters with great care, I imagine.
Yeah, I in the case of Eliza, I started with the premise that I wanted somebody to sail into the Furneaux Islands in 1830 and experience what an alien world it was to somebody from Sydney, to somebody from England. So working backwards, I needed to create a character for whom that would be the biggest shock it could possibly be. And it seemed to me that a governess working in someone's house and looking after her blind and ailing father in the forest was probably exactly the person to be struck by that culture shock. And Eliza, long before I thought about the gender of that character, I was thinking about those ideas, about the character being vulnerable and confused and taking on a whole new world. And she's also pretty fair-minded. She's reasonably resourceful and she's fair-minded. So she meets the sealers, she meets the sealers' wives, who are known as the Tyree Law. And there's a very live historical debate, going back to what we were talking about earlier, over those women and their role and how they came to be in Bass Strait. And there's one side that says this was survival, it was pragmatic, it was an adaptation, and that it saved lives for those women being in the islands with their children with these sealers. There's another side of the debate that says this was abduction, it was sexual servitude, it was, part of a wider genocidal tendency. And somewhere between the two things, I'm trying to draw a line in this novel and have Eliza explore that. So I needed her to be as open-minded and observant as she could be, so that she's reporting all this stuff to the reader. And those were the things I was thinking about long before I thought, oh, hang on, I think this needs to be a woman, which is another discussion entirely.
And she does encounter an Indigenous resistance fighter, in effect, who is, as a woman, Taronora.
Yeah, who's just an amazing character. And one of those joys of researching where you go looking for one thing and you find another. And I found Taronora along the way, and Dottie and I were talking about her before. So she was from northeast Tasmania. She was brought up in a variety of households. She was essentially handed from family to family in northeast Tassie. And in the course of being trained to do domestic things for these people, she was taught to use firearms. And so when she eventually broke out and got back on country, she was able to teach other Tasmanians how to use the English firearms on them. And it's one of those few recorded instances where the guns got turned back on the English. And so she was on the run for a lot of the second half of her life. And one of the reasons I chose 1830 for the novel was that it was the year when she was on the run in the islands, and there were boats out looking for her. George Augustus Robinson, the great conciliator, so to speak, was very much looking for her. She was widely hated and feared, and she was also extremely resourceful. So she's one of those under-documented and really fascinating resistance fighters that we need to know more about.
And Anita, the relationship between Wagadine and Louisa, the English woman who Wagadine works for, in effect, that's quite an interesting relationship, because Louisa is a Quaker and is, in theory, a sort of benign character, isn't she? And has good intentions to the local Wiradjuri people.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jason. It's interesting. Louisa, I didn't really realise Louisa was going to have such an impact on readers. And then being up here in Brisbane, one writers group, and the entire session, all they did was talk about Louisa, which is extraordinary given there's so much in the story.
Yeah, that is strange.
Well, I think because Louisa speaks to a lot of good-willed non-Indigenous Australians who want to do fantastic things, and recognise through Louisa that their intentions are either not carried through, or they realise that when they do, their intentions to do goodwill come with conditions. And so for Louisa was a Quaker. When I learned that the Quakers came out in 1832, and they came out with two main missions, which was equality, the treatment of convicts and equality for Aboriginal people, I thought, this is brilliant. I'll make Louisa. Louisa didn't have any particular background at that point when I started writing. And I thought, right, she'll be great, because she will then have a purpose for engaging with Wagadine and so forth in a meaningful way. And Louisa's not a bad character. I mean, I read a lot of material about how difficult it was also for settler women on the land. And we know that Louisa's husband, James Bradley, is quite violent and he's an alcoholic and so forth. But that relationship between Louisa and Wagadine is completely unequal, because Wagadine wants nothing from Louisa except for her freedom and to go home, where Wagadine needs her, Louisa needs Wagadine for companionship. Obviously, Wagadine's under the Masters and Servants Act that we assume, and the family assume, and we see through Louisa a whole lot of, for me, even in a contemporary sense, she actually reflects what goes on quite often in society today, where the government, for example, may say, they want to close the gap, they want to change all these things, but they're going to write the policy and they're going to make the decisions on technology for First Nations peoples, and that has been going on since the point of invasion. And Wagadine was, I wanted through Wagadine to show a character who was resilient, who was dignified, who was intelligent, and she's all the things that I see in Wiradjuri women today. And interestingly, Jock, in New South Wales, Aboriginal people weren't allowed to bear arms under the legislation in New South Wales. So that was very interesting. I don't know whether legally the resistance white fighters or any resistance fighters in Tasmania were bound by legislation, because they may well have been, but somehow got trained in using firearms. So that's interesting.
Yeah, not that I know of on the legislative front, but certainly there were people, Tonga is another one, who were actively involved in resistance, particularly in the northeast. And it's fascinating the way John Batman was really one of the great villains in that dispute, and yet he continues to be venerated in Melbourne, which I just find beyond extraordinary. The horrible.
The founder of Melbourne.
Yeah, God.
Yeah.
But on that legislation also, the legislation front, and going back to what we were earlier talking about, authenticity and responsibility, I generously had a law firm up here, Rose Norton Fulbright, that, you know, they said, how can we help? And I said, I need to know all the legislation that Wiradjuri people would have lived under in New South Wales between this period of time and this period of time. And so they, you know, found material for me, and which was much easier for them as lawyers than it was for me, because I wanted to make sure that, again, that I knew what Wollodine's rights were. And she was a completely fictional character. But when we're talking about the mix of fact and fiction, I needed her and that story with Louisa to drive the story that I wanted to tell about life for women, Australian women, settlers and so forth on the land then, because the original idea for the novel had nothing to do with Yardie and Jackie. It was about women on the land. So,
right.
yeah, so, and Wogadine is for me, is a heroine.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the fact that she survives, the fact that she endures is wonderful. Sorry, Jock, I interrupted
you. I was going to say, Anita, you remind me that there was, I think, an Australian story maybe about Tony McAvoy, the first Australian Indigenous QC. And he was talking about the idea of Aboriginal people being at the whim of government. And I think it's such an interesting expression, because when you talk about the Wiradjuri being subject to a whole range of legislation, it's a similar idea that self-determination has to always be about escaping from being at the whim of government. And that's a lot of what the Uluru Statement from the Heart is on about, is that self-determination is right. We're no longer at your beck and call. We're now designing our future. And the legislation is somehow applicable to that, that there's this set of unspoken constrictions on people. And until those are gone, you're not getting anywhere. You're not going forward.
And interesting. Sorry, Dottie, you go.
I was just going to say that the relationship between the two women, it's a really interesting picture of female friendship and how it can be distorted by the culture of the time. You know, how this Quaker woman somehow decides James is the be all and the end all, and ends up distorted herself. So it, and what, yeah, just the effect of that on female friendship is what might be intuitive is screwed by the clamps of the particular culture of the time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So during the course of, I mean, obviously writing these books, there's significant research. Can you tell us a bit about the research? Because obviously, Anita, you know, you said you learned the language, you went to country. I think you even fell into the Murrumbidgee River, didn't you?
And your research is impeccable.
And Jock, obviously, you know the Furneaux Islands. You know, you've obviously been there loads of times, and because that certainly comes through. And similarly in preservation, you know, the journey, the walk. And Dottie, the Parramatta female factory, the stuff about Market Day there, for example, is extraordinary. If you could tell us about the level and the amount of research that went into the books, I think that would be quite interesting.
Okay, well, if I start?
Yeah.
I started really with a visit to actual Parramatta female factory, you know, which is quite an amazing building in itself. It's a Francis Greenway building. It's wonderful sandstone, and at the time when I was visiting it, there was a group called the Parramatta Friends of Parramatta Female Factory. They were, and they were basically a lobby group to try and stop the buildings being taken over by various developers. And luckily they were successful, and is now a heritage item. I think, I mean, my experience with writing is that there's a sense of recognition. And I was looking at the wall, and if you looked at parts of the sandstone wall, you could see where somebody had carved their initials in there, you know, really. And you'd think, well, who was that person? You know, why did they carve their initials? And I suppose that was the start of the process. And there was also around that time, in connection with the Friends of the Female Factory, there was a touring exhibition which had photographs and images of the various women involved in the factory. And that again went with the idea of fictionalizing the woman whose story I tell, because some of those pictures, there were actual photographs of or images of the real woman there, but there were also just silhouettes, you know, just heads, and that was it. And And then at Range, there's you do your historical reading. You look at there's a very good book called Cargo of Women by Babette Francis, and I was interested in I was really interested in the emotional cargo rather than the sense of a physical cargo. I was interested in the culture, the history they brought with them, particularly Molly Malone, who brings that whole 1798 year of liberty, all that Irish, which is part of my problem. So that as reading everything I could get my hands on, basically.
Yeah. So Anita, I mean, you've touched on the amount of research you did, but can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, I went down to Wagga at least 8 times in that period of time for language lessons, but also I spent time in Wagga Library, and quite often we think that all the knowledge is on the shelves in libraries, and I shout out to the librarians in Wagga City Library and Gundagai Library, because I rang up, I said, I'm coming down, I've got this amount of time, and I get there and there's a trolley of everything I needed between this period and this period for me to go through. It's great. And same thing in Gundagai Library, they have a community history area and so forth. And in that library, so in 2017 was the unveiling of the statues of Yari and Jackie on Sheridan Street in Gundagai. But there's a number of memorials around the town. So the town isn't very big. So I walked that a number of times as well and looked at all those things. I stood in the Murrumbidgee. I stood in the floodplains also in Wagga, and I imagined what life must have been like for my ancestors. I with my group, cut a coolaman. I did all the things that we also see when Yindi takes his sons out for a few days, and we learned so much about the landscape and how to use different natural resources. And I did all of that. And so I did a row. I wanted to imagine what it was like to be on the water, on the Murrumbidgee in a canoe. Now, obviously, those 4 men went out during the flood. Yari, Jackie, Tommy Davis and Long Jimmy, but it was only Yari and Jackie who saved 59 lives, as it were. But what I learned in that moment being on the river, now I go out in November, beautiful blue sky, I've got a life jacket on, I'm in a group of 20 people, and a canoe that seats 2. I'm never going to drown, right? I fall in. I have for a moment I get an element of fear because I'm still a bit afraid it's freezing water. But what I learned in that 20-kilometre row down river was I learned how incredibly knowledgeable those men must have been to able to work that river with one person at a time on their canoe in torrential rain and raging floodwaters over 3 days. And I thought, this is knowledge and skill that's never been recognised as well. So, and all on top of them being heroes. So I'm a method writer, so I try to get into that space. And the language stuff I sent to people in my cohort at Charles Sturt University to read, Uncle Stan Grant, Auntie Elaine Lomas, and so forth, because I had 2 months of severe anxiety before the book came out. I was nauseous for 24/7, I had blood tests. And because I wanted to make sure that the people of Gundagai, whose story it is, are happy with the way they've been represented as a town. I met a direct descendant of somebody, Ian Horsley is his name, and his great-great-grandfather was saved by Yari. And so I wanted to make sure. Yeah, and
that's amazing.
Yeah, and he is the most beautiful soul. His family have erected a statue on the family property. They've donated a sundial to town and so forth. And he came along to the launch in Gundagai. And so for me, the research in any of my books is far more significant than the writing. Far more. Right. Takes me more time because I can write fast, and I'm a plotter, so everything's mapped out. And so the research is the stressful thing for me.
Jock, what about your research?
I was just thinking about that, and I agree with Anita very much that the research is the mountain from which you're kind of quarrying little bits of mineral. And I often have these discussions in the editing process about you get sucked into including things in the novel because you found them in the research. And you think this is just too good to pass up. I've got to put this on the page. And Mandy, who is my editor and has been throughout, she can pick those things absolutely remorselessly and say, get it out. It's doing nothing for the story. You just found it somewhere. and she's always right. But I have this thing about what I call the White Glove Act, which is the ability to go into an archive and get out the white gloves and find the original diary and carefully turn the pages and, you know, breathe in the cursive and all of that. And I've never been much good at it. And I felt like I was just starting to get the hang of the White Glove Act when the pandemic came along and you couldn't get into libraries anymore. So that was almost going to be the threshold that I was going to cross. So what I have, I guess, instead of the White Glove Act is what Anita refers to, which is the getting in a boat or walking a coastline. And I've done lots of those things. And I think it's really important to make the point about historical research that it can be very experiential. It can be all sorts of things, quite aside from poring through archives. And it's evolving over time for me. So I am working through diaries, but I'm getting better at researching online and perhaps getting a little bit better at not being so literal about the things that I find. Although you do find absolute gems. And of course, truth is stranger than fiction. So often the things that you find won't work well as a fictional deployment because they're just illogical. They're so incredibly random that oddly enough, the fiction is more conservative than what actually happened. But yeah, I love that process, and I love the winnowing down from a giant amount of material to something that at its core is about empathy between people, that you can wander around in the documents as much as you want, but if you're not bringing a reader to a point of understanding this person who's long since gone, then there's no point being there at all. And everything has to point back to that idea that I, as the writer, and you, as the reader, we need to find empathy with this person who can't speak for themselves.
So the emotional truths of historical fiction are as important as the history, the truth.
I think it's the whole reason you're there.
Yeah.
Because it's really about how people change and how they don't change.
Yes. Or I sometimes think of it as, are these people entirely different people, or are they us in funny clothes? And I still don't know the answer, to be honest.
But you obviously have been around the Furneaux Islands quite a fair bit. That's the impression I got from the book, anyway.
No, you're quite right. And one of the things that really strikes me about that place, and other writers, Anita and Dottie, would be struck in a similar way, is that it's physically beautiful. It's really entrancing because they're these huge granite boulders that produce this extraordinarily white sand. So the shallows are incredibly clear and the vegetation is reasonably undisturbed. So everything is in this gorgeous, pristine state. And yet, underneath all of that, there have been some really shocking misdeeds in those islands over history. And the way in which you physically experience a place and try to imagine what went before when there's no physical trace to hold in your hand. That's a really important process, but it's also a very uncanny feeling to know that you're 200 years down the track from terrible stuff and that you're 20 or 30,000 years down the track from another entire civilization that I don't have the expertise to see properly. Those things are extremely humbling, I think.
I know this is probably a question writers of historical fiction probably ask all the time, but are there other writers of historical fiction whom you particularly admire?
Well, for me, I jumped straight to Hilary Mantel. I think she's fabulous.
Yeah.
But lots of others as well. But they do vary. Like I mentioned the historical fiction thing as well, and I think they're to be avoided. Really, they're the dress ups, not the be ups.
Yeah.
I have some specific books I like. Obviously, Kate Grenville's The Secret River, I think, was extraordinary, and the theatrical production in Sydney that Sydney Theatre Company did was just brilliant. And most of that was done in the Sydney language. I loved Marcus Zuzak's The Book Thief. I thought that was that's in my top 10. And I loved Mirandy's book from last year. And I think the idea about is when you learn, you learn I don't know that I wouldn't have picked up a non-fiction book to learn about the gold rushes in Queensland, and I could not put a novel down. And so, yeah, they're just three. If anyone's looking for a recommendation, there's three.
I'm a little bit more in the neighbourhood of, I guess, I'm trying to think of the right expression, but maybe narrative history rather than historical fiction. So the book that really affected me a lot was there's a story of Burke and Wills written by a woman called Sarah Murgatroyd. It's called The Big Tree. And she wrote it in about 96. She was quite young at the time and she was very sick and she died shortly after it was published. But it is an extraordinary attempt to marry practical research with what I was talking about, that attempt to understand people. It does it so beautifully and it's so readable. And then there's all these great authors, historians working at the moment, like Claire Wright and Mark McKenna and Tom Griffiths and Grace Karskens. I mean, there's a host of these people who are writing really accessible history. They're coming out of the academy, but it's not academia. It's really accessible writing. And that's, I think, driving this kind of surge of interest in reassessing things. Like if you take The Dig Tree, most of us would argue that it's a story that we more or less understand because we were force-fed it at school. But to have people come along in the 21st century and reappraise it and take it apart and reassemble it is extraordinarily valuable, I think. I love that little sort of genre.
Okay. Now, there are a few questions and comments here, which we might see what. So Robin Young, she says it's a comment, but about your comment, Jock. So how much of what is termed history is subjective and how much history is fact?
None of it.
That is a very big question.
I think it's all subjective. After I wrote Preservation, I wrote a thesis about writing preservation, and the idea was, how do you erase yourself when you write historical fiction? And the answer is you can't. There is absolutely no way to approach this material that's not, in some sense, subjective. It's important to try, but you're never, ever going to quite efface yourself. And that's true, as much as that's true of me, it's true of the person who wrote the diary in 1830. And I guess what's important is to be discerning about what their agendas are and to try to see through them. But you're never, ever going to get to the objective empirical truth.
Yeah, there was an interesting comment yesterday in our session about complicated love. And Emily Maguire was talking about her family and there are four siblings. And she was saying, well, how I see my parents, all my other siblings will have a completely different truth about the parents and the upbringing and everything, completely different truth. And that must be the case with history. I mean, yes, you can say that so-and-so was killed at a particular moment at a particular place, but how that's written about changes everything.
Well, Jason, if we all came back tomorrow and we asked all of us four and all those logged in to record the history of today, I guarantee you, I do this with my students, that everybody would record it differently. There are facts that can't be changed. It's Saturday afternoon. It's the Right Around the Murray Festival. We are the four panelists. We're all fantastic. Facts that can't be changed. And everybody knows the way that those facts are remembered. Like, and we're all recording it through a lens, and we're recording panelists, and other people are recording it as zooming in, and that's what makes it subjective. I think readers need to be aware of the lens that the author writes through, and we need. Sorry, Johnny.
So I was just going to say that I think the other important thing is that the relationship between history and myth and constant myth making that goes on. Because if you talk, for example, like if I talk to my aged mother, her recollection of things that happened way back when is nothing like my recollection of the same thing. So you've got this mythic evolution that happens over time as well.
Yeah, it's a different.
That means that. Sorry, Jason. I think one of the really satisfying ways to write and read history is to do it from multiple viewpoints, to bring in a number of voices looking at the same event. because it's a bit like Emily Maguire's family. All of a sudden you realise that it's actually 5 or 6 families. Similar thing happens.
Or in my family, in my family, my view was I wrote an article for The Age about how I was Dad's favourite, not thinking it would upset anybody. And then I had a sibling that wouldn't speak to me for weeks. I was like, everybody knows I was Dad's favourite, but clearly everybody didn't know, or their interpretation of that their relationship was so completely subjective. Yeah.
But that's one of the things historical fiction allows you to do as well, you know, to go to different characters and explore those stories without necessarily being bound to a particular documented set of facts.
Yeah. And I'm always intrigued that, you know, now history books as such, there are so many coming out that are revealing so much about stuff that you thought was hidden. I mean, take Cassandra Pybus's biography of Truganini, for example. You know, who would have thought that there would have been this new biography of her?
And also the whole idea that Truganini was the last Tasmanian.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's clear that those books, even with new content, are needed because, you know, we're still using literature across genres to break down all those myths around the history, because the history was recorded by the settlers.
Yeah, absolutely. Now there's another question. Oh, sorry, Jock, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think also the same process is happening in long-form journalism, that in the last 2 days, there's been 2 ABC pieces, one about the Carmody and Bustle families in Western Australia, and one about Tom Wills, who's the so-called inventor of Aussie rules. And both of them were stories about modern families discovering an ugly secret in their past and then taking the time and the care to go back to Aboriginal people and ask about those events. And new and disturbing stories emerge, but there's an important process of truth-telling that comes with it. And it's amazing that is still happening and things are still being unearthed and there's still big conversations to be had, even after all this time. And you know, a lot of complacency gets swept aside.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, there's another question, a question from Kate Folds, who says, and maybe we've touched on this, but can any of the authors share something new they learned researching the facts, perhaps something that surprised them? Well, quite a lot, I imagine, but who would like to answer that one?
I didn't know about the Quakers. You know, that was, you know, obviously I heard about the Quakers, you know, so like, but so I think for me that was a really interesting find, and I'd be interested. I haven't done any more research to see how much of that their original passion for equality when they arrived in Australia, how that's played out today, how that's changed, or you know, what outcomes there's been over history. Because obviously when I was researching, I was just focusing on that period of time.
Dottie?
Well, I guess just exploring the letter that Matron Gordon wrote to her daughter, whose name was Letitia, and you look up, the name means, you know, joy and happiness and so on, and that's what she's looking for, and that's what's missing. So just little incidental things, you know, like the crockery that they use, the kind of, like I said, the little carved stone walls, all those tiny, the minutiae of life. Yeah.
For me,
texture.
I was trying to think of a good example, but the one I can come up with is that there is a ship's captain in the burning island who is a cross-dresser. And it would give away too much to talk about why, but I had no idea what it would be that he would be wearing. So I had to spend a lot of time on the Victoria and Albert Museum website looking at dresses, so that I could dress my captain.
Sure.
Okay. There's a
my spare time, Anita.
A very quick, now we haven't got much time left, so a very quick question from, we need a quick answer from a question from Sally Densher. What would your main advice be to a novelist who is keen to start writing historical fiction?
I would say read historical fiction. Read the genre you want to write in. And I'm a plotter, so if you've got an idea, write a synopsis and then plot it out before you, and then research and then write.
I would go along with reading. Yeah, just read and immerse yourself in particularly the period that particularly interests you. You know, whether you start with something that relates to your own area of expertise, perhaps, or your own family, but find a connection.
I think mine would be, like I was talking before about the White Glove Act, don't be daunted by the archive, but use all of the resources that are available to you and all of your talents and things you've got access to as your research. There are actually multiple ways into a historical story, not just the archive, as important as it is.
And a very final quick question directed to you, Anita, from Kate Folds, wondering whether you wrote any of your novel sitting on the bank of the Murrumbidgee River.
Kate, everywhere I went I had a notepad in my hand. I didn't actually write with my laptop. I did in Gundagai. I had my laptop in a little caravan park thing. But when I was out on country learning and everything with my cohort, I'm taking notes the whole time. I think they thought I was taking them for my assessments. I was taking them because the whole time I was unfolding the story in my head. So always taking some notes. Every bird I saw, every tree I saw, I was writing down names and so forth.
Okay, well, look, I think unfortunately we've run out of time. I suspect we could have gone on a significantly longer, actually. But so I would just like to say, Anita, Jock and Dottie, thank you so much. It's a shame we weren't in the library, but thank you. It was wonderful. Now, to people watching, if you want to buy their books, so this is Dottie's Of Breath and Blood, Anita's River of Dreams. I didn't try to pronounce it again, Anita. That's pathetic of me. Yeah. Jock Serong's The Burning Island. You can buy them from Dimmock's in Albury if you are lucky enough to be in Albury, where you'll get 25% off during lockdown, free delivery, and you can get them on click and collect. But there are also any other bookshop in the country will have these books, and I'm sure you can get them click and collect from them. So in half an hour, there's a final session of this year's Right Around the Murray Festival, which if you haven't booked, you can book on the website. It's a deep and rich conversation traversing personal, planetary and cultural change with Delia Falconer, Rick Morton and Ailsa Piper. And so that's it. This is the end of the penultimate session. And once again, Anita, Jock and Dottie, thank you so much.
Thank you. Mandangul. Thank you.